Hi, this is a podcast about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley life. So let's start. Mary Shelley, or Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, was born on 30 August 1797 in London. Her father was a political novelist and her mother was a famous feminist, and unfortunately she died just after Mary's birth. So Mary was raised by her father and her older half-sister Fanny Imlay. She didn't have a formal education, but she grew up in an intellectually environment. So Godwin was known for his political liberal ideas, and their home welcomed many poets, including Mary's future husband Percy Shelley. She met him when she was 14, and 2 years later they began a love affair. In July 1814, they ran away to France and then traveled through Switzerland. The father of Percy refused to give any financial support, and in fact they were not married. Percy and Mary returned to England in September 1814, and a few months later Mary gave birth a baby girl, who died after a few days, and during her life she had 5 children, but only the 4th one survived and lived to be an adult. The loss of her children caused her great suffering and frequent episodes of depression. Other tragic events were the suicide of Mary's half-sister and Percy's wife. So Percy and Mary decided to get married. They despite through financial difficulties and personal misfortunes, but they enjoyed the company of their friends, including a famous poet, Lord Byron. The year 1816 is known as the year without summer, due to the eruption of the volcano Mount Tambora the previous year, caused extreme weather around the world. It blocked sunlight and caused 3 years of planetary cooling, and was a disaster for the agriculture and in all the northern hemisphere. Byron wrote a poem about the experience called Darkness, and he challenged his friends to write a ghost story. The winner was Mary with her famous novel Frankenstein, and she had the idea of the story during a dream. The Shelleys moved to Italy in March 1818 because of their financial debts, and they had no intention to come back to England. So this was for the Shelleys a period of great unhappiness. Also because they due the death of their children, and Percy had numerous love affairs, and Mary suffered by depression. And in 1822, Percy died because his boat sank in a storm, and him and his friend drowned. At the age of 24, Mary returned to London as she worked to publish Percy's poems. For the last 11 years of her life, Mary was very ill and died on 1st February 1851, probably of a brain tumor. So the Godwin novel Frankenstein starts with a stranger, that is Victor Frankenstein, begin his narration. He starts with his family background, birth, and early childhood, telling Walton about his father Alphonse and his mother Caroline, and Alphonse became Caroline's protector when her father Beaufort died in poverty. So they married 2 years later, and Victor was born soon after. Then he described his childhood companion, Elizabeth Levanza, entered his family. At this point, there is a divergence between the original and revised version of Frankenstein, because in the original, Elizabeth is Victor's cousin and daughter of Alphonse's sister, and when Victor was 4 years old, Elizabeth's mother dies, so she was adopted into the Frankenstein family. In the revised version, Elizabeth is discovered by Caroline on a trip to Italy, and Caroline noticed this blonde girl and discovered later that Elizabeth is the orphaned daughter of a Milanese nobleman and a German woman, and that the Italian family can barely afford to feed her. So Caroline adopts Elizabeth and brings her back to Geneva. Victor's mother decides at the moment of the adoption that someday Elizabeth and Victor should get married. Elizabeth and Victor grew up together as best friends. As a teenager, Victor became more and more interested and fascinated by the mystery of the natural world. He chances upon a book by Cornelius Agrippa, a 16th century scholar of the occult science, and becomes interested in a natural philosophy. He witnesses the destructive power of nature when, during a raining storm, lightning destroys a tree near his house. A modern natural philosopher accompanying the Frankenstein family explained to Victor the workings of electricity, making the idea of the alchemist seem outdated and worthless. At the age of 17, Victor leaves his family in Geneva to attend university at Ingolstadt. Just before Victor departs, his mother catches scarlet fever from Elizabeth, whom she has been nursing back to health, and dies. On her deathbed, she begs Elizabeth and Victor to marry. Several weeks later, still grieving, Victor goes off to Ingolstadt. Arriving at the university, he finds quarter in the town and set up a meeting with a professor of natural philosophy, Mr. Crampy, who tells Victor that all the time he has spent studying the alchemist has been wasted. So Victor attends a lecture in chemistry by a professor named Waldman. This lecture convinces Victor to pursue his studies in the science. Victor attacks his studies with enthusiasm, and ignoring his social life and his family far away in Geneva, he made rapid progresses, and fascinated by the mystery of the creation of life, he began to study how the human body is built. So he started with anatomy and how it fell apart, that and decay. After several years of tireless work, he masters all that his professor had to teach him, and he goes one step further, discovering the secret of life. Probably, he decided to begin the construction of an animate creature. He wanted to create a new race of wonderful beings. So, for this project, he neglects everything else: family, friends, social life, and grows increasingly pale, lonely, and obsessed. One stormy night, after a month of labor, Victor completes his creation, but when he brings it to life, its appearance was awful and horrified. So, Victor rushes to the next room and tries to sleep, but is troubled by nightmares about Elizabeth and his mother's corpse. He woke to discover the monster looming over his bed with a grotesque smile and rushes out of the house. He spent the night in his backyard, and the next morning he goes walking in the town of Ingolstadt, frantically avoiding a return of his now haunted apartment. So as he walks by the town inn, Victor comes across his friend Henry Clerval, who was just arrived to begin studying at the university. Delighted to see Henry, he brings him back to his apartment, and Victor enters first, and he is relieved to find no sign of the monster, but weakened by months of work and shock at the horrific being he has created. He immediately fell ill and with a nervous fever that lasts several months. Harry nurses him back to health, and when Victor has recovered, gives him a letter from Elizabeth that had arrived during his illness. Elizabeth later expressed her concern about Victor's illness and entreats him to write to his family in Geneva as soon as he can. She also told him that Justine Mortitz, a girl who used to live with the Frankenstein family, has returned to their house following her mother's death. After Victor has recovered, he introduces Henry, who is studying Oriental languages, to the professor and the university. The task is painful, however, since the sight of any chemical instrument worsens Victor's symptoms. Even speaking to his professor torments him. He decides to return in Geneva and awaits a letter from his father specifying the date of his departure. Meanwhile, he and Henry take a walking tour through the country, applying their spirits with the beauty of nature. So those were the major events that happened from the chapter 1 to chapter 6, and I also talked about Mary Shelley's lives. I really hope you enjoyed the podcast, and there's no time left, so bye.
Mary Shelley was born in London in 1797. She was the daughter of two radical thinkers, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a famous feminist and author of A Vindication of the Right of Woman, who died after her birth. In 1801, her father married his neighbor, Mary Jane Claremont, and they had also two children. She is like Mary, and they had a difficult relationship. She didn't have a formal education, but she grew up in an intellectual, exciting environment. In fact, her father's house was a meeting point of famous philosophers, writers, and poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which had a great influence on her novel Frankenstein. Mary met Percy Shelley when she was 14, and they had a relationship even though he was married and they had two children. For this reason, Godwin opposed the relationship, so they ran away to France and Switzerland, but they had to return to England due to financial problems. They returned to England in September, and a few months later, Mary gave birth to a baby girl, who died after a few days, and she had also 4 children, but only one lived, that he called Percy Florence. The loss of her children caused her depression and suffering. Mary's half-sister and Percy's wife, Harriet, committed suicide, so Mary and Percy decided to get married to obtain legal custody of his children, but their idea didn't work. In 1822, her husband died during a storm while sailing near Livorno, so Mary Shelley returned to England with her son, and she continued to write novels. In History of a 6 Weeks Tour, Mary wrote about her travel in Europe with Percy. She also wrote Matilda, that was published after that in 1959, Valperga in 1823, a historical novel, and The Last Man, a story about the destruction of mankind by a plague until only one last surviving man is left. She's best known for Frankenstein or The Mother Prometheus, that she started to write while she was in Switzerland with Percy Shelley. Mary revised Frankenstein, and she created the horrific demon of all time. She died in London in 1851. The main character is Victor Frankenstein, a man driven by ambition and scientific curiosity, but also the monster is important. The other characters are Victor's family, his wife, his parents, his son, and his best friend. Dr. Frankenstein is a brilliant scientist who is obsessed with the idea of gaining control over life and death, refusing the limits of contemporary science. He carries out his research alone, and he creates a monster with the organs of a dead man. The monster is so scared that even Frankenstein is frightened when he sees him. He escapes from the laboratory and appears in the Swiss Alps, where he is rejected by all men that he meets for his clearly non-human features. His anger towards others is manifested by killing of Frankenstein's best friend, his brother, and his wife. The monster takes refuge at the North Pole, knowing that in a place of total desolation he will kill no more. Dr. Frankenstein follows the monster to kill him, but is seriously injured and he is accused of not having compassion. The story ends with the monster being carried away on a ice raft in the Arctic Sea. The monster is described as strong in every sense and potentially dangerous. He had a yellow skin and is ugly. Victor Frankenstein had created life from that, and the creature is an abomination. The monster is as pieced together from aesthetic myth as he is from dead bodies. On one hand, the Frankenstein monster is subservient to his creator, who is the only man with enough knowledge to create another of his kind. On the other hand, Frankenstein is subservient to his creation, because it's physically stronger than him and able to murder his whole circle of family and friends. Their relationship is not marked by a simple hero-villain pattern. Neither of these men are exactly heroes but neither of them are anti-heroes. The authors sympathize both while condemning them both simultaneously. The creature method of desolating Victor's art is not to kill him directly.
Mary Shelley, born in Somerstown, was a British writer, essayist and biographer. At the age of 29, he wrote the Gothic novel of Frankenstein, published in 1818. The story begins when Captain Walton, in his ship in Arctic Ocean, sees a huge man driving a dog sled across the ice. After, he sees another man lower than the first driving a dog sled. This man was very tired and about to die, so Captain Walton takes him to his ship. This man is called Dr. Victor Frankenstein. He grew up in Geneva. He lived with his parents, his cousin Elizabeth, and his little brother William. He has a best friend called Harry Clerval. Dr. Frankenstein is a brilliant scientist who is obsessed with the idea of gaining control over life and death, refusing the limit of contemporary science. He wants to bring some things to life, so he created a monster of gigantic proportion from assembled body parts. The monster has an horrible appearance, so that after creations, Victor regrets for having created such a demoniac creature and wants to destroy it. So Victor ran away frightened. The next day, the monster had disappeared. For the next month, Victor was sick and was cured from his best friend, Clerval. After, he received a letter saying that his youngest brother had been found murdered. On his way home, Frankenstein saw the monster that he had created and immediately realized that he was the responsible for his brother's death, but was arrested and sentenced to die. Justin, a good friend of the family. Frankenstein started traveling in the Alpine valleys with his family, but there he was confronted with his creation, who told him his life story. When the monster escapes from the laboratory, went to the village where he was insulted and attacked by the frightened villagers. The monster becomes a victim of an unjust society. From the moment of his birth, he lives isolated and rejected by people. The monster at the beginning is a creature of good and delicate feelings that suffers a lot from the abandonment of his creator. He went to the country and found a refuge in a hovel next to the small house inhabited by an old blind man and his two children. By observing the family and by reading their books, the monster learned how to speak and read. The monster wants to be friends with his host and decides that if he talks to the old man first, the old man will listen because he was blind. But his children returned unexpectedly and horrified by his appearance. They beat him and he fled the house. The monster, completely disappointed and full of rage, wanted to find his creature. Moreover, he gets shot while he is on his way there just because he stopped to help a woman who was drowning. He met Frankenstein's younger brother in the forest, and when he discovered that the boy was the brother of Frankenstein, he shocked him. The monster's only request from Frankenstein was that he should create another being, a female to accompany him. If Frankenstein complied, he and his bride would stay away from other people and keep to themselves in the wild. Victor agreed to the monster's request and left for England to finish his work, accompanied by his friend Clerval, promising to marry Elizabeth on his return. When Frankenstein was creating the new female monster, he was afraid that they might hate each other, or that they might produce a war race of these creatures. When the monster visited to check on the progress, Frankenstein destroyed his work. The monster swore revenge and promised to be with him on his wedding night. The following day, a body was found, and Frankenstein was accused of murder. He was taken to the body, which he identified as Henry Clerval. He was eventually cleared of all charges and returned to Geneva in a very bad condition. Frankenstein married Elizabeth after promising her to tell her his horrifying secret the following day. Remember the monster threat? Frankenstein was convinced that he will be killed that night. The monster, however, killed Elizabeth instead. Frankenstein lost another family member as his father died after hearing the news about Elizabeth's death. Frankenstein had now lost every sensation except for her revenge. He followed the monster everywhere, which eventually led him to the Arctic region, where he was taken aboard Walton's ship. Victor died, and just after his death, Walton finds the monster hanging over Victor's body. The monster speaks of his sufferings. Because of all the murders he has committed, he now hates himself. Since his creator is dead, he decides it is time that he too will rest in death. As we can see, the relationship between Frankenstein and his monster is not very friendly. On the contrary, it is based on continuous revenge and grudges. So my podcast ends here. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.
Today I want to talk about the two main characters of the story Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, and the characters are Victor Frankenstein and the monster. We know Victor as a man who loves science, and we can see his obsessive fascination with artificially created life. He described his ambition as an external force beyond his control. His ambition might have been a powerful desire, but it was still an internal feeling that he could have tried to control rather than allowing it to direct his action without considering consequences. Victor discovered the secrets of life and created an intelligent monster, from whom he recoils in horror. Victor keeps his creation as a secret. After the creation of the monster, his reactions show his lack of humility and his arrogance, rather than pausing to consider how impressive the discovery of others have been. Victor immediately focuses on outdoing them. His drive to surpass the accomplishments of others may be a part of why he fixated on the bold and reckless goal of artificially creating life. The other protagonist is the monster, that was intelligent and sensitive, but it was really horrible. We have an accurate description of his body and face, but he was feeling abandoned and seek to revenge against his creator. As I said before, the monster, when he came to life, was disorientated and he felt alone. Became difficult to him find a place to live, and the first human that he sees screamed and ran out, and everyone was terrified by him. When he finally finds a shelter by for animals, one day he decides to stay in that place, and he can see inside the home. He learned how to speak and how to understand words, but everyone was terrified by him, and his feeling makes him very sad.
This is Frankenstein podcast. Let's start. Frankenstein is a novel published anonymously in 1818, but many literary critics think that Mary Shelley had written it in 1816. Mary Shelley was born in London in 1797, but his birth name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, because she was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. But in 1814 she met her future husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a poet who admired her father. In 1816, the couple moved to Geneva. This is a very important city for Mary's literary production, and in those years she started to write her first and best work, Frankenstein, or Modern Prometheus, another name for this novel. It's also interesting that after her husband's death, she devoted the rest of her life to editing and publishing his work, but at the same time Mary wrote 5 more novels, the best of which is The Last Man, a story of an apocalyptic world where all men died until only one man survives. But now we focus on Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the story of a monster and his creator, Dr. Frankenstein. This novel is the romantic version of the most wanted ancient dream, the creation of artificial life. This is also the result of the many sciences discoveries in that period and the curiosity of man. But in this novel we can also find the macabre and the horrific of Gothic tales. It is very interesting, the figure of Victor. His biggest dream, in fact, was to overcome man's limitations and acquire a godlike power. But Mary Shelley shows that everything leads to consequences, and a man should not put himself on the same level as God. However, in this novel we can find more. The monster created by Frankenstein is a perfect example of the union between Gothic and sublime. It is Gothic because we have elements that cause horror in the mind, like the terrifying appearance of the monster, for example, but it is also sublime because we can find a mixed feeling of pleasure and horror. The monster, in fact, represents the isolation of the individual by society. So he became like a hero for many people who feel excluded like him. It's very interesting that the monster is different to the stereotypical idea of monster, because in the first part of the story, for example, he is not bad or mad. He is like a kid who needs an education that teaches him how to recognize the right from the wrong. Now let's focus on the major events from chapter 1 to chapter 6. So, the plot. The novel begins with the story of an explorer, Robert Walton, at the North Pole, who, during his voyage, finds a stranger in the snow. This stranger was Victor Frankenstein, who started to tell him the story of his life. Frankenstein tells him that he was born to an important family in Geneva, and he had a sister and a brother, William. His sister was Elizabeth, and she was adopted when she was young. Victor had a best friend, Clerval, and he was an important person in his life. When Victor went to university, he met Mr. Crampy and Mr. Waldman, and they taught him natural philosophy and chemistry. And all this information helped him for his project, create a human with electricity. He created the monster, but when this beast opened his eyes, his yellow eyes, Victor ran away. After leaving home, Victor met his best friends on the street. Clerval was there because he wants to tell him that her sister was very ill. Victor went home to see where the monster was, but he wasn't there. the monster ran away. After many months, Victor read a letter from his father. His father told him to return to his family because William was murdered. Victor thought that the monster killed his brother, but strangely, a woman, Justine Moritz, pleaded guilty, and she died the next day. Victor was so confused, so he went to Bellerive to change location. During a walk in Bellerive, he saw a monster. He saw the monster, and he wanted to kill him, but the monster just wanted to tell his story. After the creation, he said that at the beginning of his life he didn't know anything, but he started to observe a family all day, and sometimes he went to take some food. But when he decided to meet these people, they started to kill him and he ran away. Thanks for your attention and see you in the next episode.
This is Frankenstein podcast. Let's start. Mary Shelley was born in London in 1797. She was the daughter of two radical thinkers, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who died after her birth. She was a writer. She published her most famous novel, Frankenstein, in 1818. In 1814, she fell in love with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was already married to another woman. The two ran away to France and after moving all around Europe, were forced to return to England due to financial problems. They were meant to have a daughter, but she unfortunately passed away. After Percy's wife found out about their affair and she committed suicide. In 1816, they got married and had kids. In 1818, they moved from England to Italy. There, their two kids, Clara, Evelina, and William, died and were their only surviving son, Percy Florence, was born. In 1822, her husband died, leaving her alone with her only remaining son. She died at the age of 53 in 1851. Frankenstein is a Gothic horror novel written by Mary in 1816 in England at the age of 19. Frankenstein is one of the biggest myths of literature, precisely because its roots are human fears. The creature is the example of the sublime of the different and as such causes terror. The story is about Victor Frankenstein, the scientist who created the monster. Various things happened in these chapters, which we will get into soon. An important theme in this novel is the bond between the scientist and his creation. It was a master-slave bond, but at certain point Victor's whole family gets murdered by the monster, his wife, brother and best friend. After killing Victor's family, the monster escaped to the North Pole because it was the best
isolated place where no one could find him. Victor chased after him to kill him, but on the way he was seriously injured. Frankenstein is a monster created by Victor. For this reason, he takes his last name and was created by organs of dead people. The most important characters in this novel are Victor Frankenstein, the monster, Elizabeth Lavenza, William Frankenstein, Robert Walton, and Justin Moritz. The bond between them, according to Victor, had to be master-slave, for the simple reason that he had created it, and for having given him a life. Since the creator didn't understand what this bond meant, he accepted the fact that he was its slave, but the more conscious he got, the more he rebelled. We see an important scene where Frankenstein's monster follows his master Victor in his bedroom. On the night that Victor Frankenstein created this monster, he got so horrified about his creation appearance that he ran to his bedroom. He later fell asleep and had horrifying nightmares about his mother's corpse and Elizabeth. He woke up with a agonizing feeling and found the monster on top of him, staring him in sleep.